The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning. Learners should be able to recognize how word choices, imagery, and sound devices affect mood, meaning, and theme. Learners should also be able to recognize that verse and stanza forms, rhyme, rhythm, and punctuation affect meaning.
Thanks for joining me today for another lesson in our series, Getting into Poetry. My name is Charlotte, and today we will look at the different types or forms of closed form poetry that you are likely to encounter. It is important to be able to identify the different types of poetry, not only for your examinations, but also for your classwork. Now we are going to start looking at the general categories that poetry is divided into. The first of these categories is lyric poetry. Let's start with a definition. A lyric originally referred to a song performed in ancient Greece to the accompaniment of a small harp-like instrument called a lyre. Now the term is used to refer to any fairly short poem in the voice of a single speaker, although the speaker may sometimes quote others. The two other broad categories are epic poetry. This is a very long narrative poem that can extend over hundreds of lines. An example of a great epic poem is Paradise Lost by John Milton. And dramatic poetry. This is poetic monologues or dialogues performed by a character or characters that the poet assumes. An example of dramatic poetry is Ulysses by Tennyson. Most of the poetry that you will encounter is lyric poetry, and the types of poems that we will discuss today fall within this category. In this lesson, we will examine the features of ballads, odes, elegies, and haiku. The first form that we will examine is the ballad. Ballad tells a story and is usually written in 4-line stanzas. Ballads frequently have a chorus or refrain that is repeated throughout the poem. Ballads were originally songs sung by wandering minstrels in the Middle Ages. They fulfilled an important function as a form of communication. During the Middle Ages, there were no newspapers, phones, or sophisticated media. As you can imagine, sometimes the minstrels would embellish the stories to make them more interesting, so the ballads weren't always strictly accurate. Ballads usually dealt with history and legend, love and passion, crime and battles, and family events. The narrator of the ballad played a passive role in the story. He held the position of a storyteller and did not comment on the content of the ballad. The narrator is the voice relaying the story to the listeners. The stories related in ballads were frequently tragic and aroused emotion in the listeners. Ballads are easy to understand and their rhythm is obvious. Now let's look at a stanza from a ballad to give you a better idea of how it works. She'd taken all the clothes she had against the biting cold, and in a note to him she wrote, "I've taken all your gold." As you can see, this is a part of a story. The rhythm and rhyme are strong, and if you read a ballad out loud, it should be clear that it could be sung. Now the next type of poem that we will learn to identify today is the ode. Originally, music accompanied odes, and they are examples of lyric poems. Here is a definition of an ode. Odes are lyric poems that have a majestic tone. They are intended as hymns of praise, focusing on a single person, object, or abstraction. The function of an ode is to uplift its subjects to a higher level by praising it at length. One of the most famous odes in English literature is the ode To Autumn by the Romantic poet John Keats. In this poem, Keats describes the season of autumn in an exalted way. You should be able to find a copy of this poem on the internet or in most English anthologies, and I urge you to take a look at it. It will certainly give you a clearer idea of the lyric nature of these types of poems. Now let's look at 2 lines from the ode. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. You will notice that the diction or words that have been chosen praise autumn by suggesting that it is a gentle and beautiful season. Always remember, when analyzing a poem, you have to consider the choice of the words of the poet, the punctuation, the rhyme, the rhythm, and the form of the poem to fully understand the intention of the poet. Do not allow yourself to become absorbed with only one aspect of the poem. Now we will examine what an elegy is, and this type of poem is easy to identify. An elegy is an example of a lyric poem that is identified by its subject matter. An elegy is an expression of grief for the death of a person or the loss of a loved object or place. As you can see, by definition, an elegy is a sad or a mournful poem and will never have a light-hearted tone. It usually has a slow and subtle rhythm. An elegy frequently causes its listeners to think deeply about his or her own life and the importance of special people. Now let's look at 2 lines from a well-known elegy, just to give you a better idea of the mood of this type of poem. These lines are from the poem Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. The ploughman homeward plods his way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Look at the diction chosen by Gray. The words plods and to darkness and to me suggest the somber and sad mood of the poet. Because the poet has used long vowel sounds, which makes it difficult to read this poem quickly, this too suggests the somber subject matter of the poem. Even the title indicates sadness. Traditionally, churchyards were the sites of the graves of the people in the area. But enough of this serious stuff. The next type of poem that we are going to examine is the haiku. Now these poems are fascinating because they are really short but very descriptive. They too have a very strict structure that is adhered to. The haiku is a traditional Japanese form of poetry. A haiku is a deceptively simple poem, and it often requires one to read it more than once to fully enjoy it. Here is a definition of a haiku. A haiku is a 3-lined poem. The first and third lines have 5 syllables, and the second line has 7 syllables. The haiku focuses on images, usually connected to nature. It is interesting to note that a haiku focuses on observation, so the picture presented by the poem is extremely visual. Now let's take a look at a haiku so that you can get a better idea of this form of poetry. Faceless, just numbered, lone pixel in the bitmap, I, anonymous. Here the poet used computer terms like pixel and bitmap as a metaphor for himself. Now, any electronic picture that you see is made up of millions of pixels, and by using the image of 1 pixel out of millions, the poet captures the feeling of loneliness and isolation that an individual can feel in this busy, rushed modern era of ours. Now, this is also an excellent example of poems that we can get from the internet. This poem we got from a website called Haiku for People. Now let's take a closer look at the structure of this haiku. In line 1, we have faceless, just numbered. which comes to 5 syllables. The second line has 7. Lone pixel in the bitmap. And the third line has 5 syllables. Anonymous. The restrictions placed on a poet by the form of a haiku does not limit the poet, but it helps him to focus his ideas in a neat and effective description. We have looked at 4 different types of poems today, and it is essential that you try and identify poems that comply with the features of these forms of poems. Now let's recap the forms that we have learned today. The ballad, ode, elegy, and haiku. It would be impossible to teach you all the different types of poetry in one lesson, but these 4 and sonnets that we will discuss in our next lesson are the ones that you are most likely to encounter in your examinations and tests. As you can see, all these forms, ballad, ode, elegy, and haiku fall under the category of lyric poetry. When you study poems in class or read them for your own enjoyment, try and see if any of them can fit with the definitions that you have learned today. If you are not sure whether you are correct, ask your English teacher. Now, to reinforce what we have learned today, it is time to put your creative and poetic skills into action. Write a haiku of your own. As you do this, remember that in a haiku, the first and third lines have 5 syllables, while line 2 has 7 syllables. Your haiku should deal with something you have observed. Join me for our next lesson when we will examine sonnets as a form of poetry. See you then.